The wind was the first thing and the last thing. It was a constant thief, stealing the moisture from the cracked earth, the hope from a person's soul, and the words from their mouth before they could be properly spoken. It carried the red dust of the Arizona high country in a ceaseless, scouring sigh, dusting every surface, getting into the food, the water, and the lungs. It was a sermon on permanence, and the sermon said only the rock and the wind would remain. Eliza Jane Whitcomb tasted grit on her teeth as she cinched the last of the cured hides onto the pack mule. The animal shifted its weight, its ribs a stark washboard beneath its dusty coat. Everything was skinny that year. The cattle, the mules, her younger brother Jonah, and herself. The sun had baked the land into a brittle biscuit, and the rains had forgotten them. Jonah leaned against the crooked porch post of their cabin, squinting at the vast, bleached sky. It was a sky so wide it made you feel like a lost ant on a dinner plate. A sky that promised freedom but delivered a profound loneliness. He was 16, all sharp angles and restless energy, an energy that soured in the face of the endless drought. He said, "We should not be selling the last of the hides. What if we do not get through the winter?" Eliza pulled the knot tight, her knuckles raw. She answered, "What if we do not get through next week? The flour is almost gone. Jonah, the beans are a memory. These hides are the only coin we have left. This will get us supplies from Prescott. It has to—" He kicked a loose stone, sending a puff of red dust into the air. "It is a long ride for nothing." "It is not for nothing," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the wind's low moan. She turned to face him, her face smudged with dust but her eyes clear and steady. Her hair, the color of corn silk, was braided tightly to keep it from whipping into her eyes. "It is for us. Now, check the water barrel again." He sighed but did as he was told. He returned a moment later, shaking his head. The hollow thump of the barrel was answer enough, barely a few inches in the bottom. Enough for the ride, but not much else. Eliza nodded, her jaw tight. "It will be enough. I will be careful." She looked toward the small, fenced plot where her father and mother lay. The simple wooden markers were tilted, pushed by the same relentless wind. They had come west for a new start, for land of their own, but the land itself had claimed them first, one with a fever, the other with a bad winter. It left Eliza to be the bedrock for Jonah. She swung herself up onto her mare, a sturdy buckskin named Patience. It was a fitting name. Out here, patience was not so much a virtue as a tool for survival. She took the mule's lead rope. "I will be back in 3 days, 4 at the most. Stay close to the cabin, and keep the rifle loaded." Jonah just nodded, his face a mask of worry he tried to hide. "I will." The ride to Prescott was a study in brown and blue. The brown of the earth, the rock, the withered scrub, the piercing blue of the sky. The landscape was beautiful in a brutal, unforgiving way. It did not care if you lived or died. It simply was. Eliza rode with a straight back, her eyes scanning the horizon. She felt the weight of her responsibility with every plodding hoofbeat, a weight as real and as heavy as the sun on her shoulders. By the second day, she reached the small cluster of buildings that huddled around a bend in the Verde River, a settlement that was little more than a whisper of a town. Its heart was Mistress O'Rourke's roadhouse, a long, low building of adobe and timber that offered a bed, a hot meal, and a whiskey that could peel paint. Margaret O'Rourke, a widow with arms as thick as posts and a wit as sharp as a new knife, ran the place with an iron will. Eliza sold the hides at the mercantile for a disappointing price, the merchant complaining about the quality, the times, the whole blasted territory. She took what she could get and bought flour, salt, beans, and a small bag of coffee, a luxury she knew they could not afford but bought anyway. A small comfort was worth more than a few pennies in the face of so much hardship. Before starting the long ride back, she led her animals to the roadhouse trough and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and frying bacon. Margaret O'Rourke was behind the bar, polishing a glass. Her graying red hair was piled high on her head, and her eyes missed nothing. She looked up as Eliza entered. "Well, look what the wind blew in. Eliza Jane Whitcomb. You look like you wrestled a dust devil and lost. Child." Eliza gave a small smile. "I believe I did. Mistress O'Rourke, and I believe the dust devil won. A cup of your coffee, if you please." Margaret poured a thick, black brew into a tin cup. She said, "On the house, you look like you need it more than I need the nickel. How is that brother of yours still growing faster than a weed in a wet spring?" "He is well," Eliza said, the warmth of the cup seeping into her cold hands, though not much is growing these days, weed or otherwise. "That is the truth," Margaret sighed, leaning on the bar. "It is hard times for everyone, except for the ones who know how to make hard times work for them." She nodded her head toward a corner table. Eliza followed her gaze. 3 men sat there, their heads bent close together over a map. One of them, a man with a fleshy face and small, shrewd eyes, was doing most of the talking. He wore a dusty but well-made suit, a stark contrast to the buckskin and denim of the other patrons. His name was Silas Crow, and he had the look of a man who could smell $1 buried a foot deep in solid rock. He was buying up mining claims all over the valley, promising progress and jobs. Eliza took a sip of her coffee, the bitter liquid a welcome shock. She could not hear their words clearly, just the low rumble of Crow's voice. He was gesturing at the map, his finger tracing a line through the heart of the valley. One of his companions, a rough-looking man with a scraggly beard, spoke up, his voice a gravelly rasp that carried across the room. "It is Apache land. Mr. Crow, they will not give it up easy. Their water runs through there." Silas Crow chuckled, a low, greasy sound. "Land belongs to them that can use it. Progress needs copper, and that valley is full of it. We just need to persuade the tenants that their lease is up. A bit of encouragement is all. We just have to clear the valley, one way or another." He took a long drink from his glass, his eyes glinting. "The army is stretched thin. Lieutenant Mercer at the fort is young, ambitious. He just needs the right motivation to see things our way. A few incidents. He will be a hero, and we will be rich." The words, not meant for her, landed in Eliza's mind like stones. A cold dread, colder than the wind, settled in her stomach. Clear the valley. The phrase was so simple, so clean, but she knew what it meant. It meant fire and fear. It meant driving people from the only home they had ever known, all for some buried rock. She finished her coffee quickly, paid Margaret for the stabling of her animals, and left without another word. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western clouds in shades of orange and blood. The knowledge of what she had heard soured the small victory of the purchased supplies. The world suddenly felt much more dangerous. It was near dusk on her final day of travel. The land bathed in the soft, gray light that comes just before darkness. When she saw it, a small shape huddled beside a cluster of rocks, away from the faint track she was following. At first, she thought it was a coyote or a small deer, but as she drew closer, she saw it was a child, an Apache child, a boy no older than 6 or 7, his small body curled into a tight ball. Her hand went to the rifle in its scabbard, an instinct born of years of stories and warnings. But then she saw the boy was shivering, despite the day's lingering warmth. His face was flushed, his lips dry and cracked. She dismounted, her boots making soft sounds in the dust, and approached slowly, her hands held out where they could be seen. The boy did not stir. He was burning with fever. His breathing was shallow and fast. Eliza looked around. The landscape was empty. There was no sign of a camp, no sign of his family. He was alone. Her heart went out to him. He was just a child, sick and alone. All the warnings, all the fear, melted away in the face of that simple fact. She unhooked her canteen from the saddle. The water was precious, more precious than gold, but she did not hesitate. She wet a piece of cloth from her saddlebag and gently bathed the boy's face, his forehead, his neck. He mumbled something in a language she did not understand, his eyes fluttering but not opening. She trickled a few drops of water onto his lips, which he licked at weakly. She did not know what else to do. She could not take him with her. She did not know where his people were, and bringing him to the settlement would cause a world of trouble for them both. All she could do was offer this small moment of care. She sat with him as the sky deepened to purple and the first stars appeared, occasionally wetting the cloth and cooling his skin. Suddenly, Patience snorted and stamped a hoof. Eliza looked up, her body tensing. He was just there. He had not been there a moment before. And now he was a man, standing as still as the rocks around him. He was Apache, tall and lean, with a quiet intensity that seemed to suck the air out of the space around him. His face was stark and unreadable, his black hair long and tied back with a simple leather band. He held a bow in one hand. He was not looking at her, but at the child. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She stayed perfectly still, her hand on the ground, far from her rifle. This was it, the moment everyone had warned her about. The man moved, fluid and silent, and knelt beside the boy. He placed a hand on the child's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked at the damp cloth in Eliza's hand, then at the canteen lying beside her. His dark eyes lifted and finally met hers. She expected anger, suspicion, violence. She saw none of it. What she saw was a flicker of something she could not name, a deep and solemn assessment. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, thick with the sounds of the desert night. Then, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you. Without a word, he gathered the small boy into his arms as if he weighed nothing and turned. He walked away from her, melting back into the shadows from which he had come, leaving Eliza alone with the vast, starry sky and the sound of her own breathing. She did not move for a long time. When she finally reached the small rise that overlooked her family's homestead the next morning, the first thing she saw was the fence, new posts, raw and yellow against the old, weathered land, barbed wire, glinting sharp and cruel in the morning sun. It cut a straight, ugly line across the landscape, and it went directly across the path to the creek, the same creek whose water table fed their well. The same creek the Apache had used for generations. On the other side of the fence, near the creek bed, a crude camp was being erected. Tents, a half-finished shack, and men with rifles. Silas Crow's mining camp. As she watched, a small group of Apache women and children approached the fence, their water jugs empty. One of the men from the camp walked forward, raised his rifle, and fired a shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed in the still morning. The women scattered, retreating back into the scrub. Eliza sat on her horse, the bag of flour and beans suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The wind picked up, blowing dust into her eyes, but it could not obscure the hard, clear line that had just been drawn across her world. Silas Crow had not wasted any time. The clearing of the valley had begun. The quiet defiance of the new fence settled over the Whitcomb homestead like a shroud. Jonah was a storm cloud of frustration, pacing the length of their small porch. "It is a provocation," he said, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and anger. "They have no right. That is our water." Eliza, unpacking the meager supplies, did not look at him. She answered, "A right is only what a man can hold on to. Jonah, Silas Crow has men with rifles. For now, that gives him the right. So we do nothing. We just let him choke us off." "No," she said, finally turning to face him, her eyes dark with a resolve that went beyond her years. "We do not do nothing. We watch, we listen, and we do not give him the fight he wants. Not yet. He wants an excuse. We will not be his excuse." For 2 weeks, a tense and brittle peace held. The miners at Crow's camp worked, their shouts and the ring of their hammers a constant, grating noise on the wind. The Apache, Eliza noted, simply vanished. They did not approach the fence again. They melted back into the canyons and the high mesas, a silent, watching presence. The well at the Whitcomb cabin grew shallower by the day. The water they drew was thick with mud. One morning, the last of their salt pork turned. The heat had ruined it. Eliza knew then that they could not wait any longer. They needed more salt to preserve the 2 rabbits Jonah had managed to trap, and her brother was developing a hacking cough that worried her deeply. The dust was getting into his lungs. "We have to go back," she announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Not all the way to Prescott, just to the settlement. I need horehound for your cough, and we need more salt than I thought." Jonah argued. "It is too dangerous. What if Crow's men—" "What if you cannot breathe by next week?" she countered, her voice softening slightly. "We will be careful. We will take the wagon and stay to the old lower trail. It is longer, but it keeps us out of sight of the camp. We will go and be back before sundown." The journey was slow and nerve-wracking. The old wagon, its wheels groaning in protest, bumped and swayed along the rocky trail. The canyon walls rose up on either side, their red faces pocked with shadows. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. The sun beat down, and the air was still and close. They were halfway through a narrow pass, the walls tight around them, when the world exploded. A gunshot cracked the silence, the sound bouncing off the rock, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen rifles. A lead ball splintered the wooden side of the wagon, inches from Eliza's head. The mules screamed, their eyes rolling in terror. Jonah yelled, "Apaches!" Eliza fought the reins, trying to control the panicking animals. Figures were moving on the ridge above them, their shapes distorted by the harsh sunlight. They were painted, some of them, with streaks of clay on their faces, and they carried rifles. Another shot rang out, and one of the mules went down, tangling the harness and bringing the wagon to a sickening, lurching halt. "Get down!" Eliza screamed, pulling Jonah with her from the seat and onto the dusty ground behind the relative safety of the fallen mule. She fumbled for the rifle, her hands shaking but her mind strangely clear. This was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. It was too clumsy, too loud. The figures on the ridge were firing, but their shots were wild, kicking up dust a good 10 feet from the wagon. It was as if they were making noise, not trying to hit them. They were yelling, high, keening cries that sounded more like a performance than a real war cry. Through the haze of dust and fear, Eliza saw one of the men stumble. As he caught his balance, his foot slipped on a loose rock, and Eliza saw it. It was not the soft, worn leather of a moccasin. It was a boot, a heavy, square-toed boot with a thick heel, the kind of boot worn by soldiers and teamsters, the kind that left a deep, sharp track. Before she could process the thought, the attack was over. The figures on the ridge vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The silence they left behind was deafening, broken only by the pained breathing of the injured mule and the ringing in Eliza's ears. Jonah was scrambling up, his face pale. "They are gone." Eliza pushed herself to her feet, her gaze fixed on the ridge. She said, "Stay here." Ignoring his protest, she began to climb, her worn shoes finding purchase on the rock. She had to be sure. At the spot where she had seen the man slip, she found what she was looking for. There, in a patch of soft dirt, was the print. It was unmistakable, a perfect outline of a boot, and within the heel's impression were the small, distinct circles left by Eastern nails. She had seen prints like it 100 times around the fort. She had never seen an Apache wear such a thing. A cold certainty settled in her heart. This was no Apache raid. This was a lie, staged for an unseen audience. This was Silas Crow's encouragement. A cry from Jonah spun her around. "Eliza, help!" She scrambled back down the ridge, her heart seizing with a fresh wave of panic. Jonah was not by the wagon. He was 50 yards down the trail, pinned beneath a small rock slide that had been loosened by the gunfire and the frantic scrambling of the mules. His leg was trapped, and one of Crow's men, a straggler from the main group, was walking toward him, reloading his rifle. The man had not bothered with paint. His face was brutish and familiar. She had seen him at the roadhouse with Crow. Eliza raised her rifle, but she was too far away. Her hands were shaking too badly. She would never make the shot. The man leveled his rifle at her brother, and then a shadow detached itself from the canyon wall. It was Nantan. He moved with a speed that was almost impossible, a blur of motion against the red rock. He was on the gunman before the man could even register his presence. There was no sound, just a swift, brutal economy of motion. Nantan's arms swung, and the rifle clattered to the ground. The gunman crumpled without a cry and lay still. Nantan stood over the fallen man for a bare second before his eyes found Jonah, trapped beneath the rocks. He moved toward him, his expression unreadable. From the ridge, other figures appeared. Apache warriors. They had been drawn by the gunfire. They saw the scene, the wrecked wagon, the white boy trapped, another white man on the ground, and one of their own standing over him. Eliza ran toward them, her own rifle forgotten. She shouted, "No, wait!" Jonah, seeing the approaching warriors, was filled with a fresh terror. He cried out, "Get away from me!" Nantan stopped, his gaze shifting from Jonah to Eliza, then to the armed men behind him. The warriors fanned out, their faces grim. The air was thick with a misunderstanding, a single wrong move away from turning deadly. It was then that an older man stepped forward from the group of warriors. His hair was streaked with gray, his face a map of deep lines that spoke of wisdom and sorrow. This was Two Rivers, an elder whose voice carried great weight. He held up a hand, and his warriors halted. He looked at the chaos, his eyes taking in every detail. He spoke, his voice low and calm, the words in his own tongue. Nantan replied, his voice equally level, gesturing to the man on the ground, then to Jonah. Two Rivers then looked at Eliza. His English was slow, deliberate. "You have trouble." Eliza's throat was dry. She nodded, her eyes pleading. "We were attacked, but it was not—" She pointed to the boot prints she had seen. Their feet, they wore boots with nails, like soldiers. Nantan's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked from Eliza's earnest face to the unconscious man on the ground. He knelt and pulled at the man's footwear. It was a heavy, nail-studded boot. He looked back at her, and for the second time, she saw that flicker of assessment in his eyes, deeper this time. He saw that she was not lying. He saw that she was telling a truth that could get them all killed. Two Rivers saw it too. He looked at the boot, then at the sky, as if consulting with a power greater than any of them. He gave a quiet order. Two of his men moved forward and began to work at the rocks, pinning Jonah's leg. Their movements efficient and strong. Jonah flinched at their touch but was too weak to resist. Nantan watched Eliza. He saw no hysteria, no blind accusation. He saw a woman who, in the middle of a terrifying attack, had kept her eyes open. She had seen a detail and understood its meaning. She stood her ground not with a weapon, but with a fact. It was a different kind of strength than he was used to seeing in her people. Within minutes, Jonah was free. His leg was badly bruised and twisted, but not broken. Two of the warriors, without a word, lifted him and carried him back to the wagon. Two Rivers walked over to Eliza. He said, "The men who wear these boots are not our friends, and they are not yours. A lie is a fast horse. The truth is a man on foot. It will take time for the truth to catch up." The news of the attack on the Whitcomb wagon reached Prescott by that evening. The story, told by Silas Crow's men, was a wild and bloody tale. They claimed they had been checking a new claim when they stumbled upon a brutal Apache attack on a poor homesteading family. They had driven the savages off, they said, but not before the boy was injured and the family's wagon destroyed. The story spread like a grass fire. It roared through Margaret O'Rourke's roadhouse, fueled by whiskey and fear. It galloped up the hill to the army fort, where it landed on the desk of Lieutenant Mercer. Mercer was a young man, barely 25, with a crisp new uniform and a hunger to make a name for himself in this dusty, forgotten corner of the world. He listened to the story with a growing sense of opportunity. The settlers were terrified. The town council was demanding action, and Silas Crow was there, his voice a reasonable, concerned murmur in the lieutenant's ear, urging him to protect the good, hard-working people of the valley. "We need patrols," Mr. Crow insisted, his face a picture of civic duty. "Strong patrols. We need to show them that this territory is not a lawless wilderness. We need to establish order." Lieutenant Mercer, seeing visions of commendations and promotions, readily agreed. The pressure to earn his commission was immense. He would show them all that he was a man of action. He would bring American order to this valley. Once and for all, he issued the orders for increased patrols, with instructions to be firm. The Tia, the sparks, had been struck. Now the whole valley was tinder, just waiting for a wind to fan the flames. The lie about the attack settled into the parched soil of the valley and took root. Jonah's leg healed slowly, the deep bruises fading from purple to a sickly yellow. He was quiet, the bravado knocked out of him, replaced by a sullen watchfulness. The world had shown him its teeth, and he had learned that they were sharp. Eliza worked from sunup to sundown, mending the damaged wagon, tending to Jonah, and rationing their dwindling water, a constant, nagging worry at the back of her mind. Silas Crow's men were a permanent fixture now, their rifles glinting on the far side of the wire fence, a stark reminder of the new order. The town, when Eliza was forced to ride in for a small sack of cornmeal, was a different place. Fear was a currency being passed from hand to hand. Men gathered in knots outside the mercantile, their voices low and angry. The attack on the Whitcomb wagon was the only topic of conversation, the story growing more elaborate and bloody with each telling. Eliza heard her own name, spoken with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Why had the Apaches let her go? What had really happened out there in that pass a lie? She was learning. Was far easier for people to believe than a complicated truth. She avoided the roadhouse and went instead to a small, neat adobe house at the edge of the settlement, where a simple wooden sign read, "Anita's Sewing and Mending." Anita was a small, strong woman with kind eyes and hands that were never still. She had come from Mexico as a young girl and had built a life for herself with a needle and thread. She was mending a tear in Eliza's sturdiest dress, a task that gave them an excuse to sit in the relative cool of her front room. "They are scared," Anita said, her needle flashing in and out of the rough-spun fabric. "Mr. Crow talks to them, tells them he is making the valley safe. He buys drinks at the roadhouse and makes promises." Eliza watched a lizard scuttle across the sun-baked dirt outside the open door. She said, "He is making it safe for his own pockets. He is the one who put that fear in them in the first place." Anita looked up, her expression serious. "Be careful, Eliza. To speak against him now is to speak in favor of the Apache. People do not see a difference anymore." She paused, then added, "There is a town meeting tomorrow, at the general store. He has put forward a petition. He wants to have the public well closed." Eliza's head snapped up. "The public well, but half the town depends on that. We depend on it. Our well is almost dry." "For security," Anita said, her voice laced with irony. "He says it is a target, that the water could be tainted, that it draws savages too close to the town. He has the justice of the peace on his side." Eliza felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was a brilliant, cruel move. Crow's fence had choked off the Apache's water. Now, under the guise of protecting the settlers, he was about to choke them off too. A person could survive a lack of justice, a lack of freedom even, for a time, but no one could survive a lack of water. The next day, the general store was packed. The air was hot and smelled of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and fear. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim. Silas Crow stood at the front, beside a harried-looking Justice Miller, whose gaze kept skittering around the room, never landing on any one person for too long. Crow spoke in a smooth, reasonable tone, the voice of a man who was only thinking of the common good, friends, neighbors. We live in trying times. We have all heard what happened to the Whitcomb family. A terrible, terrible business. I say here and now, we will not stand for it. We must take prudent measures to protect our women, our children. This well, located as it is at the edge of town, is a vulnerability we can no longer afford for the safety of us all. I propose we cap it. We will rely on private wells until Lieutenant Mercer and his men can guarantee the security of this valley. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. It made sense. It was a simple solution to a complex fear. Eliza felt a tremor of anger. She looked at the faces around her, men she had known for years, and saw how easily their reason had been clouded by Crow's poison. Before she even knew she was going to do it, she stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and cut through the murmuring. "You are not protecting us, Mr. Crow. You are strangling us." All heads turned to her. Crow's face tightened, his small eyes narrowing. He gave a patronizing smile. "Ah, Miss Whitcomb, we all feel for your recent trauma. Perhaps you are not thinking clearly." "Oh, I am thinking more clearly than ever," she replied, her voice gaining strength. She was holding a worn, leather-bound journal in her hands. "My father was not a miner or a rancher. He was a man who studied the land. He believed you could not live on a place until you understood it. He spent years observing this valley. He drew maps. He took notes. He recorded the depth of the wells and the flow of the creeks." She opened the journal. Its pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting and detailed sketches. She said, "He wrote here that the public well and the dozen or so private wells in this valley are all fed by the same deep aquifer. It is all one body of water, like the fingers on a hand. He also noted that our own well, the Whitcomb well, is the shallowest of them all. If you close the public well, you force everyone onto the private wells. The strain will be too great. The water table will drop faster than a stone. In a month, maybe 2, most of them will be dry, starting with ours." She looked directly at the crowd. "This is not about safety. This is about control. Mr. Crow has already fenced off the creek. Now he wants to drain the wells. He wants to drive every last one of us out, Apache and settler alike, so he can have this valley and its copper all to himself." A stunned silence fell over the room. She had not shouted. She had not made accusations. She had presented facts. Crow's face was a mask of fury. "That is preposterous," he sputtered. "The ramblings of a dead man and a hysterical girl." A farmer near the back spoke up. "My well has been running low the last 2 weeks." Another man nodded. "Mine too." The seed of doubt had been planted. Justice Miller was sweating profusely, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. He looked from Crow's angry face to Eliza's calm, determined one. He cleared his throat. Perhaps we should postpone this vote. We should look into the matter. Study the hydrology." Eliza left the store, her heart pounding. She had not won, but she had not lost. She had bought a little time, and in this dry, thirsty land, time was as precious as water. The ride home was a blur. Her mind was racing, replaying the scene in the store. She had made an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley. The thought was terrifying, but it was also strangely liberating. The sky had been turning a strange, bruised yellow all afternoon. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, began to howl. It picked up the red dust and threw it into the air until the world was a swirling, choking vortex, a dust storm. It came on with a terrifying speed, blotting out the sun, the trail, everything. Visibility dropped to near zero. Patience whinnied, turning her back to the stinging, scouring wind. Eliza knew she had to find shelter. She dismounted, her hands over her mouth and nose, and led the mare forward, trusting the animal's instincts more than her own. The air was so thick with dust it was hard to breathe. The world was a screaming, red chaos. She stumbled, her foot catching on a rock. She fell to her knees, disoriented. Panic began to claw at her. She could be lost out here, buried by the shifting dust. A hand closed on her arm. It was firm, steady. She looked up and saw a shape through the swirling red gloom. It was Nantan. He said nothing. He did not need to. He simply pointed toward a dark slash in a rock face a few yards away. He took Patience's reins and led them toward it. The shelter was a deep overhang, a shallow cave carved by centuries of wind and water. Inside, the roar of the storm was muffled to a low, continuous moan. The air was still and cool. Eliza leaned against the rock wall, catching her breath, her lungs aching. Nantan stood at the mouth of the small cave, a silhouette against the raging red storm, watching. After a long time, the silence between them was broken by his voice. It was low and seemed to be part of the storm's deep rumble. "You spoke today, in the town." Eliza was not surprised that he knew. His people had eyes and ears everywhere. They were a part of this land in a way she could never be. She answered, "Yes." Why, he asked. "It was not your fight. They do not see you as one of them now." She thought for a moment, gathering her words. "It is my fight. It is anyone's fight who wants to live here. That well, it is not just for the town. It is for everyone. My father taught me that water has no tribe. It just is. Without it, we are all just dust." Nantan was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the storm. "My people say the land speaks. You have to be quiet to hear it. Your father was quiet." He listened. Eliza looked down at the journal in her hands, its leather cover coated in a fine red powder. He did not come here to take. He came to build. He wanted to understand how things worked. The water, the seasons, the way the plants grew. "And you?" Nantan asked, his gaze turning to her. "Do you want to understand?" "I am trying to," she said honestly. "I do not understand your people. I do not understand why you stay in a place that has become so hard, but I understand that this is your home, just as it is my home. Crow wants to burn it all down for a handful of rock. I cannot let that happen." He nodded slowly, a long, considering motion. He looked at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of a stranger. They were the eyes of a man who was seeing her, truly seeing her. For the first time, he saw the dust on her face, the weariness in her shoulders, and the unbending strength in her spine. He said, "The storm will pass, but the wind that brought it is still here." Eliza knew he was right. The storm outside was a force of nature, mindless and temporary. But the storm Silas Crow had unleashed was born of human greed, and it would not pass so easily. They waited in silence as the wind slowly died down and the red dust began to settle. When it was finally over, the world outside was clean and new, washed by the wind. The air was cool and crisp. A fragile peace had settled over the land. Nantan stepped out of the shelter and handed her the reins to her horse. He looked at her one last time. "Be careful. Eliza Jane Whitcomb. The truth is a small fire in a great wind." Then he was gone, moving as silently as he had appeared, leaving her alone in the vast, quiet landscape. She mounted her horse and turned for home, the weight of his words settling upon her. A burden and a strange sort of comfort. A connection had been made, as thin and as strong as a strand of spider silk. A line of respect drawn in the red dust. The small victory at the general store was a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of consequence were spreading. Eliza Jane Whitcomb felt the change in the air. Men who had once tipped their hats to her now looked away, their faces closed and wary. She was the girl who had spoken up, the one who had questioned Silas Crow's benevolent protection. She had chosen a side, even if she had only meant to choose the truth. The valley held its breath, waiting for Crow's next move. It came 3 nights later, written in fire against the black velvet sky. A dull orange glow flickered on the horizon. In the direction of the mining camp, it grew quickly, a hungry, angry pulse that painted the undersides of the clouds. Jonah saw it first, his voice a choked whisper from the doorway. "Eliza, look!" They stood together on the porch, watching the distant blaze. Shouts carried faintly on the night wind, thin sounds of alarm. The fire was at the mining camp's supply depot, a large wooden shed set away from the main tents. Jonah's hand tightened on the doorframe. "It is them, the Apache." Eliza stared at the flames, a cold feeling coiling in her gut. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "It is not. Why would they burn supplies? They need supplies more than anyone. And why now, just when everyone in town is starting to doubt Mr. Crow?" The answer was as clear and as terrible as the fire itself. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, whose hand had set that blaze. Silas Crow was not a man to be challenged. When his words failed, he simply created a new, more horrifying story. By morning, the news was all over the territory. A savage, unprovoked attack, the mining camp's entire winter larder, gone, flour, bacon, beans, all turned to ash. Crow's men rode into the settlement, their faces smudged with soot, telling a harrowing tale of fighting off dozens of warriors in the dead of night. They had found tracks, they said, moccasin prints everywhere. Lieutenant Mercer, his face set in a grim, determined line, needed no more convincing. His ambition and his duty were now perfectly aligned with Crow's narrative. This was an act of war, an open defiance of the United States Army's authority. He gathered a patrol, a mix of his own uniformed troopers and a dozen of Crow's men, deputized on the spot. He called it a limited punitive expedition. Its purpose, he declared, was to sweep the Willow Draw area and restore order. Eliza knew it was a hunt, and she knew they were hunting the wrong people. While Jonah was out checking their rabbit snares, she made a decision. She scribbled a hasty note, telling him she was tracking a stray calf and would be back by nightfall. It was a weak lie, but it would have to do. She saddled Patience, took her rifle, and a small sack of water and dried jerky. She could not let another lie stand unchallenged. She needed proof. She rode cautiously, keeping to the low ground, using the sparse cover of juniper and mesquite to stay hidden. The patrol was easy to follow. They were not trackers. They were a posse, loud and clumsy, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. They rode with an arrogant confidence, their voices and the jingle of their gear echoing through the canyons. Eliza watched them from a high ridge, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. They were moving toward Willow Draw, a winding canyon with high, rocky walls, a place known to be a seasonal encampment for the Apache. It was a trap, and they were the bait. As the patrol moved deeper into the draw, Eliza saw one of the deputized miners lag behind. He guided his horse into a thicket of scrub oak, dismounted, and wrestled with something heavy from his pack. He rolled a small, sturdy crate into the underbrush, then hastily remounted and hurried to catch up with the others. It was done with a furtive haste that screamed guilt. Eliza waited until the sound of the patrol had faded before she made her way down to the spot. The crate was partially hidden beneath a low-hanging branch. It was not large, but it was heavy. She pried at the lid with her knife. Inside, nestled in straw, were several bottles of whiskey and 3 boxes of Army-issue cartridges, and burned into the wooden lid of the crate was a small, unmistakable symbol, the silhouette of a crow. It was Silas Crow's personal mark, the one he put on all his mercantile goods. This was it, the proof. This crate was meant to be found. Mercer's men would stumble upon it and see it as clear evidence that the Apache were trading for liquor and ammunition, a clear violation of treaty terms. It was the final piece of Crow's puzzle, the justification for whatever happened next. Eliza's mind raced. She could not carry the heavy crate herself. She had to get to Lieutenant Mercer. She had to show him this before he walked his men into a disaster of Crow's making. She remounted Patience and urged the mare into a trot, taking a shortcut over a rocky mesa that would, with luck, put her ahead of the patrol. It was then that the sky turned against her. The air grew heavy and still, the light taking on a sickly, greenish tinge. The temperature dropped so fast she shivered. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled up over the mountains, moving with an unnatural speed. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The first hailstones were the size of peas, rattling against the rocks and her hat. Then they grew to the size of marbles, then acorns, coming down with a furious, deafening roar. They struck with the force of thrown rocks, hitting her shoulders and back, stinging her through her clothes. Patience screamed, a high, terrified sound, and began to buck and plunge. The ground was turning white, the stones bouncing and skittering, creating a treacherous, shifting surface. Eliza fought to control her mount, but the mare was lost to panic. Patience reared, her hooves slipping on the icy stones, and Eliza was thrown. She landed hard, her head striking a rock. The world exploded in a flash of white pain, and then a wave of darkness washed over her. The roar of the hail was the last thing she heard. When awareness returned, it came in pieces. The pain in her head was a sharp, throbbing beat. The hailstorm had lessened to a driving, ice-cold rain. She was soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Her left ankle was twisted beneath her at an impossible angle, sending lances of agony up her leg. Patience was gone, fled in the storm. The crate, the proof, was miles away. She was alone, injured, and helpless. Despair, cold and sharp as the rain, began to set in. Through the gray sheet of rain, she saw a figure approaching. It moved with a steady, unhurried gait, seemingly unaffected by the treacherous ground. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was one of Crow's men. She tried to reach for her rifle, but it was several feet away, half buried in a drift of hailstones. The figure knelt beside her. It was Nantan. His face was grim, his clothes soaked. He had been watching, too, not her. He had been watching the patrol. His eyes took in her pale face, her shivering body, the unnatural angle of her leg. He looked at the gash on her forehead where her head had hit the rock. She tried to speak, her teeth chattering. "The crate I found." He placed a finger on her lips, a gesture not for silence, but to still her. His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw not anger or triumph, but a deep, human concern. He had every reason to leave her here, an enemy on his land. But he did not. Without a word, he ripped a strip of cloth from his own shirt and gently cleaned the cut on her forehead. Then, with a strength that belied his lean frame, he slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, the other under her knees, and lifted her as if she were a child. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her ankle, and she cried out, burying her face in his shoulder to stifle the sound. He carried her through the rain, his steps sure and steady. It was not an act of capture, it was an act of mercy. He was taking her from the storm, from the cold, from a certain death. The journey was a blur of pain and semi-consciousness. She was aware of moving through a narrow, hidden canyon, of the smell of wet pine and damp earth. When he finally stopped, they were in a small, sheltered basin. Brush shelters, called wickiups, were nestled against the canyon wall, their forms almost invisible against the rock. Smoke, thin and smelling of juniper, rose from a central fire pit. This was his home. As he carried her into the camp, people emerged from the shelters, their faces a mixture of astonishment and deep suspicion. A woman with a face as severe as the canyon rock and eyes as dark as Nantan's stepped forward. Her hair was graying, and she held herself with a stiff authority. Nantan spoke to her in their language, his voice low and urgent. He gestured to Eliza's head, her ankle, The woman looked at Eliza, her gaze sharp and penetrating, and Eliza felt a fresh wave of fear. But then the woman nodded curtly and barked an order. Two younger women came forward and helped Nantan carry Eliza into one of the wickiups. They laid her gently on a bed of soft furs. The air inside was warm and dry. The older woman entered, carrying a small clay pot. She examined Eliza's ankle, her touch surprisingly gentle but firm. A fresh jolt of pain made Eliza gasp. The woman said something to Nantan, her tone clipped. Nantan knelt beside Eliza. He said, "My aunt, Ishani. She says the bone is not broken, but the joint is badly torn. You cannot walk on it. You will stay here." Here the idea was impossible. I cannot. My brother. "You will die if you leave," he said, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "You will stay. When you are healed, I will take you back." Over the next few days, Eliza drifted in a world of pain and strange, quiet kindness. Ishani, despite her severe expression, was a skilled healer. She packed Eliza's ankle in a poultice of heated herbs that smelled of pine and damp earth, a mixture that soothed the swelling and dulled the pain. Another woman, a young mother with a shy smile, brought her broth in a clay bowl and a tea made from bitter roots that eased her headache. Eliza watched them as they worked. She saw the quiet efficiency of their lives. She learned that they built their cooking fires in deep pits, so the smoke would dissipate without giving away their location. She watched them grind mesquite beans into flour on a flat stone. These were not the savages from the stories. They were families, working to survive in a world that was trying to erase them. The women spoke to her rarely, and never in English, but they cared for her. They brought her water. They rebandaged her ankle, and in their cautious, watchful presence, Eliza began to heal. She was a guest, a patient, and a prisoner of circumstance, living in the heart of a people she had been taught to fear, and she was beginning to see that everything she thought she knew was a lie. A week passed in the hidden Apache camp. The sharp agony in Eliza's ankle subsided to a dull, persistent ache. Ishani's herbal poultices worked a slow magic, and soon Eliza could put a little weight on the foot, testing it gingerly. The quiet rhythms of the camp became familiar to her. She learned the names of the children, who would sometimes watch her from a distance with wide, curious eyes. The young mother who brought her broth was named Talis, and though they shared no words, they developed a silent communication of smiles and gestures. Eliza found herself letting go of the constant tension she had lived with for months. Here, in the heart of the supposed enemy, she felt a strange sense of safety she had not felt in her own town. But the safety was an illusion. Her mind was a constant turmoil of worry for Jonah. What was he thinking? Was he safe? Did he believe her lie about the stray calf? Or did he think she'd been captured? Or worse, and what of the crate, the proof? Every day that passed, its importance grew in her mind. It was the only weapon she had against the firestorm of lies Silas Crow had unleashed. One evening, as Nantan brought her a piece of roasted rabbit, she finally spoke of it. "My ankle is strong enough. I have to go back." He did not look at her. His attention focused on the small fire that burned in the center of the camp. "It is not your ankle that is the problem. It is your word. They will not believe it." "They will believe proof," she insisted. "The crate of whiskey and ammunition, with your mark on it. We have to get it to Lieutenant Mercer." He looked at her then, his face impassive in the flickering firelight. "Mercer is a young man in a hurry. He sees what he wants to see, and Silas Crow has shown him a picture of savages and traitors. You will walk into his office, a woman who has been missing for a week, and you will show him a box. Crow will say you planted it. He will say you are working with us." "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice laced with a desperate frustration. "Do we do nothing? Do we let him win?" "We survive," he answered, his voice low and steady. "That has always been our way." "But I cannot just survive," she said, leaning forward, her eyes pleading. "My brother is out there. My home. My name." I cannot let him take all of that from me with a lie. I have to try to. He studied her face for a long time, seeing the iron resolve beneath the fear and the weariness. He saw a spirit that would not be broken, one that mirrored the unyielding nature of his own people. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The crate is still there. I have watched it. No one has gone near. Tomorrow, when the sun is high, I will take you. The next day, they traveled slowly, Nantan guiding his horse with Eliza riding behind him, her arms loosely around his waist. It was the first time she had been so close to him, and she was acutely aware of the warmth and solid strength of his back. He moved with the land, not against it, finding paths she would never have seen. They found the crate undisturbed in the thicket. It was heavy and awkward, but Nantan managed to secure it to his horse. He took her as far as the ridge overlooking the town, to the edge of his world and the beginning of hers. He said, I will wait here until the sun touches that peak. If you are not back, I will know that you were right, and that I was wrong. She looked at him, wanting to say something, to thank him, but the words felt small and inadequate. She simply nodded, slid from the horse, and began the long, painful walk to the fort, her ankle protesting with every step. Lieutenant Mercer's office was sparse and orderly, a reflection of the man himself. He stood behind his desk, his uniform immaculate, his face a mask of stern professionalism. He did not invite her to sit. He listened, his eyes cold and assessing, as she told her story. She told him about the attack, the boot prints, the fire at the supply depot, and finally, the crate. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it onto his desk. The bottles and cartridge boxes rattled inside. She finished, her voice raw. This is his mark. Silas Crow is trying to start a war so he can have the valley. Mercer looked from the crate to her face, his expression unreadable. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle. Her face was gaunt, and there was a healing cut on her forehead. She looked nothing like the respectable homesteader's daughter he had met before. She looked like a creature of the wilderness. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, That is a compelling story. Miss Whitcomb. He walked to the door and opened it. Sergeant, bring him in. One of Crow's men entered the office. It was the rough-looking man with the scraggly beard she had seen at the roadhouse. His arm was in a sling, and he wore a self-righteous expression. This is Mr. Hobbs, Mercer said. He was part of the patrol at Willow Draw. He has a story to tell as well. Tell her what you told me. Hobbs. Hobbs looked at Eliza with a theatrical pity. I saw her. Lieutenant, a few days before the depot fire. Saw her talking to them, Apaches. Real secret, like, up in the rocks. I thought it was strange, but I did not want to make trouble. But then the fire, and now this. He gestured to the crate. It is plain as day. She is in with them. She is helping them. They probably gave her that box to try and trick you. Eliza stared at him, speechless. The lie was so audacious, so complete. It stole the air from her lungs. It is not true. He is lying. Am I? Hobbs countered, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Then where have you been for the past week? Miss Whitcomb visiting friends. We all heard you went missing. Looks to me like you have been living rough. Awful rough. Mercer's gaze was hard. The patrol I led into Willow Draw was ambushed. 2 of my men were wounded. We found evidence of a large Apache encampment, and signs they were preparing for a fight. Everything Mr. Hobbs says aligns with the facts as I see them. Everything you say asks me to believe that a respected businessman is a murderer and a liar, and that the Apache are innocent victims. He picked up one of the cartridge boxes from the crate. This proves nothing, or rather, it proves that you were in possession of stolen Army property. I am placing you under suspicion of aiding an enemy of the United States government and obstructing a military investigation. For now, you may return to your home, but do not leave the valley. Do you understand me? The words hit her like a physical blow. Her proof had been turned into a weapon against her. Her reputation, her honor, lay in pieces on the floor of this cold, orderly office. She had walked in to save her name and had walked out a traitor. She stumbled out of the fort, blind to the stares of the soldiers, and began the long walk home. The valley, her home, now felt like a prison. Every rock, every tree, seemed to be a witness to her shame. She thought of her father, of the good name he had built, and a wave of despair washed over her. She found Jonah at the cabin, his face a mixture of relief and wild anxiety. "Where have you been?" I thought. "Everyone is saying." "I know what they are saying," she said, her voice hollow. "And it is all lies." She told him everything, her words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and anger. He listened, his young face growing pale. When she was finished, he looked at the floor and said, "What are we going to do?" She had no answer. Her mind was a battlefield. To stay meant facing Mercer's charges, a trial where her word would be worthless against the combined weight of Crow's influence and the town's fear. It meant prison. And what would become of Jonah then? To run meant abandoning everything her parents had worked for. It meant admitting defeat, leaving her name to be blackened forever. It meant living the rest of her life as a fugitive. That night, she sat by the cold hearth, the weight of her impossible choice crushing her. The wind moaned around the corners of the small cabin, a lonely, desolate sound. A small fire in the hearth would have been a comfort, a small point of light and warmth against the vast, encroaching darkness. But she did not have the heart to build one. Her own inner fire, her belief in truth and justice, felt like it had been extinguished. A soft scratching sound at the door made her jump. Jonah was asleep in the other room. She picked up the rifle, her heart hammering, and moved to the door. "Who is there?" His voice was a low whisper, barely audible through the wood. "It is Nantan. Open the door." She hesitated for only a second before lifting the bar. He slipped inside, silent as a shadow, and barred the door behind him. He was carrying a small bundle. His face was grim in the moonlight that slanted through the window. "Mercer's men will be here at sunrise," he said, his voice urgent. "They are not coming to talk. They are coming to take you." "How do you know?" "My eyes are not blind. I saw the sergeant talking to Crow's men at the roadhouse. There was money exchanged. You cannot win this fight in their world. You tried. You spoke the truth, and they twisted it into a rope for your neck. So I am to go to prison for something I did not do." "No," he said. "You are to live, to fight another day, but you must leave this place, now." "But my brother—" Nantan looked toward the other room. "He will be safe. They have no quarrel with him. They will think you ran, that you proved your guilt. He will be angry and confused, but he will be alive. If you stay, he will be alone anyway. This is the only way." The truth of his words was a cold, hard blade. He was right. She was trapped. Her struggle for honor had led her to a place where she had no honor left to defend. All that was left was survival. She went to her brother's bedside and looked at his sleeping face. In the dim light, he looked so young, the hard lines of worry smoothed away by sleep. She touched his hair, a silent goodbye, a promise to return. She wrote a quick, desperate note, telling him she was safe, that she would be back, that he should trust no one. She left it on his pillow. She took nothing but her father's journal and a small pouch of her mother's things. When she turned back to the main room, Nantan was waiting by the door. He held out his hand, not to take hers, but as a gesture. "Come." She took a last look at the small cabin, the repository of all her memories, her joys, and her sorrows. Then she stepped out into the night, and Nantan led her away. They did not take the trail. He led her to a narrow, dark crevice in the rock face behind the cabin, a passage she had never known existed. They slipped into the darkness of the earth, leaving her old life behind. The small, fragile flame of her hope was not extinguished. It had been carried out of the wind, into the shelter of the rocks, into the keeping of an unlikely ally. And in the darkness, it began. Slowly, to grow brighter, the world had shrunk to the size of a hidden canyon, a secret fold in the earth where Nantan's people had taken refuge for Eliza. The days were a strange mixture of waiting and watching. She learned to read the sun not as a clock but as a presence, to understand the subtle language of the wind, and to see the life that thrived in a landscape she had once considered merely empty. But this quiet existence was a cage. Every night, she dreamed of Jonah, of her home, of the name she had been forced to leave in tatters. "I cannot just hide here," she said one evening, as they shared a meal of roasted corn and rabbit. She had been watching Nantan sharpen an arrowhead, his hands moving with an ingrained, patient skill. Every day that passes, Silas Crow's lies sink deeper into the ground. Soon, they will be the only truth anyone remembers. Nantan tested the edge of the flint with his thumb. "Then we must find a deeper truth, a truth written in their own hand." He told her then what his scouts had seen. Wagons bearing Crow's mark made regular trips, not to the mining camp, but to a remote siding on the new railroad line called Hatcher's Switch. It was a place of transfer, where goods from the east were offloaded for the territory. "A ledger," Eliza said, the idea taking root in her mind. "A shipping ledger. It would have everything. What he is bringing in, where it is going. It would be official, undeniable." "It is a 2-day ride through hard country," Nantan warned, "and there will be men guarding it." She met his gaze across the small fire, her own eyes reflecting the flames. "I have been a fugitive for 2 weeks. What is 2 more days in hard country?" The journey was a descent into a wilder, more ancient world. They followed no trails, only the contours of the land itself. Guided by Nantan's seamless understanding of the rock and the sun, they rode a single horse, a wiry Appaloosa that moved with a sure-footed grace. Eliza, accustomed to a proper stock saddle, found riding on the simple leather pad an exercise in constant, shifting balance. After several hours of clinging on as the horse navigated a steep, rocky descent, she could not help but mutter, "Are you certain this is the only way a horse can be ridden? It feels like I am trying to balance on a barrel in a flood." Nantan's back was straight, his body moving in perfect rhythm with the animal. He said, "The horse does not complain." "The horse is not sitting where I am," she retorted, a bit of her old spirit returning. A rare, fleeting smile touched his lips, though she could not see it. "A saddle with English words carved on it does not make the horse faster," he said. "It only makes the rider heavier." The land around them was starkly, brutally beautiful. Great cathedrals of red rock rose into a sky of impossible blue, their faces carved by millennia of wind. The air was thin and clean, but for all its beauty, the land was not gentle. It was filled with things that could bite, sting, or tear. They made camp the first night in a shallow basin near a dry creek bed, the barest trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock. The sun had set, painting the western sky in violent strokes of orange and purple. The silence was immense, broken only by the chirp of crickets and the soft whisper of the evening breeze. It was in this profound quiet that they heard the sound, a low, rasping cough, a sound that was not animal nor human, but something in between, a sound that sent a primal shiver down Eliza's spine. Nantan was on his feet in an instant, a silent shadow against the fading light. He pushed Eliza behind him, toward the shelter of the rocks, his bow in his hand. An arrow knocked without a sound. On a ledge of rock not 20 yards away, a mountain lion stood, its long, tawny body perfectly still. It was watching them, its yellow eyes glowing in the twilight. It was lean and hungry, a ghost of the mountains, the perfect embodiment of this beautiful, dangerous land. It let out another rasping cry, its tail twitching. Eliza's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her mind was surprisingly calm. Nantan stood between her and the beast, a fragile shield of flesh and bone. She saw him draw the bowstring back, his muscles coiling. He was not going to scare it. He was going to kill it. But a shot, even a silent arrow, felt wrong, It felt like a violation of the evening's peace. She slowly, carefully, reached for her rifle. She did not raise it to her shoulder. She kept it pointed at the ground and, with a trembling finger, pulled the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was a shocking, violent intrusion into the twilight. It ripped through the silence, echoing off the canyon walls, a sound of thunder and iron. The mountain lion flinched as if struck. It stared at them for one more heartbeat, its wild, yellow eyes wide with surprise and anger. Then, with a flick of its tail, it turned and vanished, melting back into the rocks as silently as it had appeared. Nantan slowly lowered his bow. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. He said nothing, but she felt a subtle shift in the space between them. She had not panicked. She had not screamed. She had met the wilderness on its own terms and had answered its threat with a thunder of her own. They reached Hatcher's Switch the next afternoon. It was little more than a dusty siding, a small wooden shack of an office, and a loading platform next to the gleaming steel rails that cut a stark, unnatural line across the landscape. They watched from a high, rocky outcrop for hours, their patience a thing learned from the land itself. A single, pot-bellied clerk sat in a chair tilted against the office wall, dozing in the afternoon sun. A few of Crow's men lounged by the platform, playing cards. The plan was simple, born of necessity. Nantan would create a diversion. Eliza would get the ledger. As dusk began to settle, a plume of smoke rose from a cluster of dry brush a quarter-mile down the tracks. It was not a large fire, but it was thick and oily, and the wind carried it directly toward the siding. Crow's men jumped to their feet, shouting and cursing. The clerk heaved himself out of his chair and lumbered toward the fire with a bucket. "Now," Nantan whispered. Eliza slid down the rocks and ran, her patched ankle aching in protest. She moved low and fast, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The office door was unlocked. She slipped inside. The small room smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. A tall desk stood against one wall, piled high with manifests and invoices. She began to search, her hands flying through the papers. It had to be here. She found it tucked away on a lower shelf, a thick leather-bound volume with a simple, stark crow burned into the cover. She grabbed it, her fingers closing around the worn leather. Just as she turned to leave, she heard the men returning, their voices loud and angry, complaining about the fire. She froze, her escape cut off. There was only one other way out, a small, grimy window at the back of the shack. It was a tight fit. She shoved the heavy ledger through first, then wriggled her way after it, scraping her hands and tearing her dress. She dropped to the ground outside just as the clerk's shadow fell across the front doorway. She ran, clutching the ledger to her chest, and did not look back. Nantan was waiting with the horse in a dry wash 100 yards away. He pulled her up behind him, and they were gone, swallowed by the twilight. But they had been seen. A shout went up from the siding, followed by the flat crack of a rifle shot. A pursuit was beginning. What followed was not a race, but a desperate, scrambling flight through a maze of canyons and passes. They rode the horse until it was lathered and trembling. Then they abandoned it and continued on foot. They could hear the shouts of their pursuers behind them, echoing in the dark. Nantan led her through paths that were not paths, up sheer rock faces and along narrow ledges where a single misstep meant a fall into darkness. At one point, they were cornered in a box canyon. The voices of Crow's men were getting closer. Eliza's lungs burned. Her ankle was a screaming torment. "This is it," she thought. "We are trapped." Nantan simply pointed up. A chimney, a narrow fissure in the rock wall, rose 100 feet into the darkness. It was a climb that seemed impossible, but he began to ascend, finding holds where there appeared to be none. He urged her to follow, and somehow she did, her fingers raw, her body screaming with effort. the heavy ledger now a dead weight tied to her back. They emerged onto a high mesa just as the first light of dawn was breaking, leaving their pursuers trapped in the canyon below. They found a shallow cave to rest, exhausted and battered, but alive, as the sun rose, casting a clean, golden light over the valley. Eliza opened the ledger. The first few pages confirmed what she already knew: records of whiskey, rifles, and ammunition, all consigned to the mining camp. But as she went deeper, a new set of entries appeared. Shipments of blasting powder, huge quantities, far more than any mine would ever need, and alongside them, notations, sketches of the Willow Creek Weir, the small, man-made dam that created the reservoir that fed the entire valley's water table. There were calculations, notes on stress points, on the structural integrity of the main wall. The final entry was dated for the end of the week. It read simply, "Final shipment delivered. Awaiting instructions for site clearance." Eliza looked up from the book, her face pale. Site clearance. She remembered hearing Silas Crow use those words at the roadhouse. She had thought he meant clearing the people, but he meant this. He was not just trying to scare people away. He was not just trying to choke off their water supply. He was going to destroy the weir. He was going to unleash the entire reservoir in a single, catastrophic flood down the canyon, wiping out every homestead, every living thing in its path. He was going to wash the valley clean with a wall of water, an act of God of his own making, leaving nothing behind but mud and bedrock and the copper that lay beneath. She looked at Nantan, her eyes wide with a new and more profound horror. The ledger was not just a map of Silas Crow's greed. It was a map of blood. The weight of the ledger on Eliza's lap was more than just paper and leather. It was the weight of a coming flood, of a valley full of lives that knew nothing of the doom planned for them. They sat in the mouth of a shallow cave, high on a mesa that overlooked the entire basin. The sun had long set, and a sliver of moon was rising, casting a pale, ghostly light over the land. Down below, a few faint lights twinkled from the settlement, tiny, fragile sparks of human existence. From this height, the valley looked peaceful, eternal. The knowledge they carried made the scene a terrible, heartbreaking lie. For hours, neither of them had spoken. The flight from Hatcher's Switch had stripped them of everything but bone-deep weariness. Now, huddled in the cool, dry air of the cave, the horror of their discovery was sinking in. It was a poison seeping into the silence. Eliza finally broke it, her voice a raw whisper that was nearly lost in the vastness. "He is going to kill them all. Not just my brother. Not just the people in the town who hate me. Everyone, your people, the families who have lived on that creek for generations. He will wash them all away like dirt." Nantan sat across from her, his back against the rock wall. He had been watching the valley, his face a mask of stone in the moonlight. He said, "It is the water he wants to kill first. The water is the life. The people are only in his way. For a man like Crow, people are easier to kill than a river, so he will kill the river, and the people will die with it." A terrible hopelessness washed over Eliza. "What can we do? We are two people. We have a book of his crimes, but the law has already named me a criminal. No one will listen. We could ride to the fort, and Mercer would put me in chains and take the book as proof of my treason." Her voice broke, and she wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of profound, lonely cold. She felt small, insignificant against the scale of Crow's evil and the indifference of the landscape. They had won the race. They had the truth, and it was worthless. Nantan shifted, moving to sit not next to her, but near her, closing the distance between them just enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He did not look at her, but continued to stare out at the silvered valley. He said, "When my grandfather was a boy, the soldiers came. They burned the villages. They took the people and marched them to a place where the ground was sour and the water was sick. Many died. My grandfather was one who survived. He came back. He walked for 2 moons, with nothing but the memory of these mountains to guide him. He came back to a land of ghosts and ashes. He found the seeds that had been saved. He found the hidden springs. He began again. He turned his head then, and his dark eyes met hers. His gaze was steady, a deep, quiet fire in the darkness of the cave. He said, "We are still here. We are still here because we know that a man is not defeated when he is outnumbered. He is only defeated when he gives up. You have not given up. Eliza Jane Whitcomb, you have only just begun to fight." His words did not offer easy comfort. They offered something harder, something more valuable. They offered a share of his own enduring strength, a strength forged in generations of loss and survival. She saw in him not just the warrior who had saved her, but the grandson of the man who had walked home to the ashes and planted seeds. She looked away from the intensity of his gaze, down at her own hands, which were scraped raw from the climb. They were trembling. She had been so strong for so long, first for her parents, then for Jonah, and now for this impossible truth. But in this moment, in this safe, hidden place, the strength she had worn like armor began to crack. She was just a girl, and she was so very tired. A tear she had not known was there slid down her cheek, tracing a clean path through the dust and grime. He saw it, a glint of silver in the moonlight. He did not speak, did not move. He simply waited, giving her the dignity of her own sorrow. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had been through together. The shared fear in the pass, the quiet understanding in the dust storm, the desperate flight through the canyons. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and at their most determined. A bond had been forged between them, a thing of substance, tempered in fire and flight. She looked at him again, her eyes clear now. The tears were gone. In their place was a raw and honest vulnerability. The vast, empty space of the valley night pressed in, and all the terrors it held. She needed an anchor. She needed, for just a moment, not to be a fighter, not to be a fugitive, but to be held. Her voice was barely a breath. "Hold me gently." It was a plea, a question, a statement of profound and fragile trust. He did not move for a long moment, and in that stillness, she felt the weight of her own words, the risk she had taken in speaking them. He could refuse, he could misunderstand. The fragile connection between them could shatter. But then he moved, his motion fluid and deliberate. He came closer, kneeling before her. He did not reach for her. Instead, he lifted a hand and gently, with the tips of his fingers, brushed the trail of the tear from her cheek. His touch was as light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. He leaned forward, so close that their foreheads almost touched, so close she could see the ancient patience in his eyes. He whispered, his voice a low, soft rumble. "Only if you want, then I will be yours." The words were a release, a gift. He gave the choice, the power, entirely to her. It was the purest form of respect she had ever known. In his answer, he was not a warrior claiming a prize, but a man offering his strength, his loyalty, his very self, to be accepted or refused. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, yes. And then he leaned forward that last small distance, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not born of fire and passion, but of a deep and quiet need. It was as gentle as his touch, a soft, searching pressure. It tasted of the cool night air, of dust, and of a sorrow so deep it had turned into strength. She felt the tension drain out of her, the fear and the loneliness receding like a tide. Her hands, which had been clenched in her lap, came up to rest on his shoulders. She felt the hard muscle beneath his shirt, the solid, living reality of him. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers in the dim light, asking again without words. She gave him his answer by leaning into him, her lips finding his once more. This time, the kiss was deeper, a shared breath, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that now held them. It was a promise made in the heart of danger, a small, warm shelter built against the violence of the world. It was two lonely souls finding a moment of refuge in each other, a quiet act of defiance against the hatred that sought to tear their world apart. When they finally broke apart, he did not release her. He simply held her, his arms strong and sure around her, while she rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, the moon climbed higher, and the great silent valley spread out below them, its fate resting in their hands. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was no longer her fear alone. She was not a single, flickering flame in the wind anymore. There were two of them now, and together they were a fire. The back room of Margaret O'Rourke's roadhouse was small and smelled of stale beer and old secrets. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows on the adobe walls. It was well after midnight, the roadhouse quiet for the first time in hours. Eliza sat at the small, rough-hewn table, the stolen ledger open before her. Across from her, Margaret O'Rourke's face was a stony mask, her eyes hard as she listened. Anita, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, looked from Eliza's determined face to the damning pages of the book, her expression a mixture of terror and awe. When Eliza finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice a low growl. "The man is not just a snake. He is the devil himself, to wash the whole valley away, for copper." Anita whispered, "What can we do? He has the soldiers, the town." Eliza closed the ledger. "We have this," she said, her hand resting on the leather cover. "We have the truth, but the truth is no good if it is buried with us. We need to split the risk. We need to make the truth exist in more than one place." The plan they devised was desperate. A paper trap set against a man who dealt in dynamite and lies. Anita, whose careful, precise hand had mended countless garments, would spend the night creating a meticulous copy of the most incriminating pages of the ledger. Margaret, who was due to travel to the county seat for supplies in 2 days, would take the original ledger, sealed in an oilcloth packet, and deliver it directly into the hands of the district judge, a man known to be beyond Crow's local influence. She would also carry a letter from Eliza, explaining everything. The copy would stay hidden with Eliza. "It is a long shot," Margaret said, her gaze steady. "The judge might think it is a forgery." "It is the only shot we have," Eliza replied. "While you are riding south with the law, I am going to make sure Silas Crow is too busy to notice." Before dawn, Eliza slipped out of the roadhouse and met Nantan in a grove of cottonwoods by the river. She explained the plan, the two-pronged attack of law and diversion. He listened, his face impassive. A paper trap is good, but it is slow. The final shipment has arrived. Crow will not wait for a judge. He is ready to act now. We need to stop him, not just his reputation. Mercer is the key. He is the weapon Crow means to use. We must take that weapon out of his hand. "But how?" Eliza asked. "He thinks I am a traitor. He will not listen to me." "He will not listen to words." Nantan agreed. "So we will show him a picture. Crow wants Mercer to attack my people at Willow Draw. I will not let my people be the bait in his trap. Instead, I will be the bait. I will lead Mercer and his patrol away from the draw, toward the copper mine. I will lead them to the blasting powder. When Mercer sees the explosives with his own eyes, he will have to believe." The risk was enormous. To deliberately draw the attention of the patrol was to invite a bullet. It was a plan that could only be conceived by a man who valued his people's lives far more than his own. The storm broke the next afternoon. It came on fast, a bruised purple wall of cloud that swallowed the mountains and unleashed a torrent of cold, driving rain. The world was reduced to a gray, streaming curtain. It was under the cover of this storm that Silas Crow, his face a mask of smug satisfaction, rode to the fort. He found Lieutenant Mercer staring out his office window at the deluge. "The weather's with us, Lieutenant," Crow said, shaking the rain from his hat. "The savages will be holed up in their dens. A perfect time to strike. They will not expect an attack in this." Mercer was hesitant. My men are scattered, taking shelter. A patrol in this weather is madness. And leaving a known threat to fester on our doorstep is not, Crow countered, his voice sharp. That Whitcomb girl is still out there. With them. Who knows what they are plotting? Every moment you delay gives them more time to prepare. Strike now. Strike hard. End this. The pressure, the fear of appearing weak, the constant whisper of Crow's poison. It was too much. Mercer's ambition won out over his caution. He gave the order. A patrol of 20 men was assembled, their faces grim as they mounted up in the pouring rain. Nantan was waiting for them. He let them see him, a fleeting glimpse of a lone rider on a ridge. Just enough to set the hook. As he expected, Mercer took the bait. The patrol wheeled, abandoning its course for Willow Draw, and gave chase. The pursuit was a chaotic, desperate affair through the slick, treacherous canyons. Nantan was a ghost, always just ahead, drawing them deeper and deeper into the wilderness, away from his people, toward the mine. Eliza, her copied pages wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath her cloak, had followed Crow from the fort. She rode not patience, but a fast, lean gelding Margaret had provided. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her to the bone, but she barely noticed. A cold fire of determination burned in her belly. This had to end. Tonight. She reached the mine just as the full fury of the storm hit. Lightning split the sky, followed by peals of thunder that shook the very ground. The mine entrance was a dark maw in the hillside. Nearby, a wooden loading platform stood over a set of tracks that led from the mine. Silas Crow was on the platform, directing his men as they unloaded the last of the blasting powder from a wagon and carried the heavy crates into the mine. His face was alight with a manic energy, a man on the verge of realizing his grand, terrible vision. The echo of rifle fire from a distant canyon reached them, faint beneath the roar of the storm. Crow looked up, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. That will be Mercer. Keeping the savages busy, he looked at one of his men. It is time. Get the fuses. It was then that he saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, a solitary, rain-drenched figure, the gelding's reins in her hand. For a moment, he simply stared, his smile faltering. "You," he breathed, his voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "It is over. Silas," she said, her voice clear and steady over the storm's howl. "I have the ledger." His eyes widened, and then narrowed into slits of pure hatred. He saw it all then, the chase, the diversion. He had been played. He let out a roar of rage. "You meddling little—" He turned to his men. "Light the fuses! Light them all! We are clearing the site now!" He was not just going to destroy the weir anymore. He was going to destroy the evidence. He was going to bury the explosives, the mine, and anyone who knew about them, under a mountain of rock. Just as his men scrambled to obey, the patrol burst into the clearing. Mercer, his face a mask of grim determination, was at their head. They had been led directly to this spot. They saw it all: Crow, his men, and the crates of blasting powder being moved into the mine. Crow did not hesitate. He grabbed a lantern, smashed it on the rain-slicked wooden platform, and threw a lit match onto the spreading oil. The fuse to the main charge sputtered to life, a small, angry snake of fire hissing in the rain. Nantan, who had appeared on the ridge behind the patrol, saw the burning fuse. He yelled a single word, a warning in his own tongue, a word that meant fire, earth, death. Mercer, seeing the sputtering fuse, finally understood. He had been a fool, a pawn. He spurred his horse forward, toward the mine entrance, intending to stop the blast, but he was too late. The explosion was a deafening, gut-wrenching roar. The ground bucked like a living thing. The entire front of the mine collapsed in a tidal wave of rock and dirt. The force of the blast threw Mercer from his horse. He landed hard, and the collapsing earth surged toward him, a dark tide of rock and mud. He was going to be buried alive. He closed his eyes, a final, bitter taste of failure in his mouth. Then, strong hands seized him, pulling him back, dragging him away from the landslide. He opened his eyes and looked up into the face of his savior. It was Nantan, the man he had been hunting, the savage he had been sent to destroy, had just saved his life. The truth, in that moment, was brutal and undeniable. The loading platform had partially collapsed in the blast. Silas Crow was staggering to his feet, a long bloody gash on his face. He had a pistol in his hand. He saw Eliza standing in the rain, her own small pistol now in her hand. His face twisted into a snarl of pure malice. "This is all your fault," he screamed over the dying rumble of the explosion. "You and your redskin lover. You have ruined everything." He raised his pistol. The world seemed to slow down. Eliza saw the dark hole of the barrel, the rain dripping from his hat, the mad fury in his eyes. She did not think. She acted. Her own pistol came up, bucking in her hand. The shot was a flat, sharp crack in the storm. Crow cried out, a sound of surprise and pain. His pistol clattered to the wet planks. He stared in disbelief at his right hand, at the dark, bloody hole that had appeared through his palm. Eliza walked onto the platform, the rain streaming down her face. Her pistol still held steady. She had not aimed to kill. She had aimed to stop him, to disarm him, to end his reign of terror not with another death, but with the cold, hard reality of justice. Mercer, helped to his feet by Nantan, stared at the scene. He saw the wounded, sputtering Silas Crow. He saw the brave, rain-soaked young woman who had tried to warn him. He saw the Apache warrior who had saved his life. And he saw, with a terrible soul-searing clarity, the truth. "It is over," Eliza said again, her voice no longer a plea, but a judgment. It was finally, truly over. The rain fell through the night, a steady, cleansing downpour that washed the soot from the air and turned the raw, bleeding earth of the landslide into dark, slick mud. In the gray light of dawn, the valley was a world transformed. The immediate violence was over, replaced by a stunned, sober quiet. Silas Crow and the men who had followed him were under guard, their arrogance washed away, leaving only sullen, mud-splattered defeat. Lieutenant Mercer, his uniform torn and filthy, moved among his troopers with the heavy, deliberate motions of a man aged a decade in a single night. He avoided looking at Nantan, who stood apart, a silent, watchful presence against the rocks. But the weight of the warrior's gaze, and the debt of his own life, was a palpable thing. The journey to the county seat was a grim, silent procession. It was not a victory parade. It was the slow, methodical work of justice beginning to turn its great, heavy wheels. When they arrived, they found Margaret O'Rourke waiting for them on the steps of the courthouse, a formidable, unmovable figure. She held a sealed oilcloth packet in her hand, and when she saw Eliza, a look of profound relief washed over her face. She had delivered the original ledger to District Judge Alistair Blackwood that morning. The trial of Silas Crow was not a long affair. The evidence was absolute, a fortress of facts against which his blustering denials and accusations crumbled to dust. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. People had come from all over the county to see the man who had tried to buy a valley with fear and dynamite. Judge Blackwood was a stern, hawk-nosed man with eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense. He listened without expression as the county prosecutor laid out the case. He read from the ledger Margaret had delivered, his voice a dry monotone that gave the words an even greater weight. He spoke of shipments of whiskey and rifles intended to arm a private militia. He spoke of the deliberate incitement of violence against the Apache, and he spoke of the vast quantities of blasting powder and the cold, calculated plan to destroy the Willow Creek weir. A low murmur of horror went through the courtroom. Lieutenant Mercer was the first key witness. He stood before the court not as a conquering hero, but as a humbled officer. He spoke in a low, clear voice, admitting his ambition, his prejudice, and his catastrophic failure of judgment. He recounted how Silas Crow had fed him a steady diet of lies, playing on his desire to prove himself. He told the court that he had been led on a false chase, and that the man who had saved his life from the landslide was Nantan, the Apache warrior he had been sent to hunt. He looked directly at the judge. "I was a fool, Your Honor, and my foolishness nearly cost this entire valley its life. I was an instrument of Mr. Crow's greed, and for that, I accept full responsibility." Then Eliza was called to the stand. She walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of her ordeal, but her back was straight and her head was high. She placed the copied pages of the ledger on the witness stand beside the original. She told her story, beginning with the words she had overheard in the roadhouse. Her voice did not tremble. She spoke of the fake raid, of the boot prints with their eastern nails. She spoke of the planted crate of ammunition, of her flight, and of the final, terrible discovery in the ledger. She looked at Silas Crow, who glared back at him, his hand bandaged, his face a mask of impotent rage. She felt no fear, only a great, weary sadness for the ruin he had wrought. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Silas Crow was found guilty on all counts: corruption, inciting public violence, illegal arms trafficking, and attempted mass destruction of property and life. Judge Blackwood sentenced him to the territorial prison for a term that would ensure he would never see the valley again. The change back home was slow, but it was real. Lieutenant Mercer, as his first official act of penance, drafted and signed a binding military accord with the territorial authorities. It designated the Willow Creek watershed a protected zone, guaranteeing shared and equal access to the water for all residents, settler and Apache alike. The ugly barbed wire fence at the mining camp came down. The people of the town, shamed by their own fear and gullibility, took up a collection. It was not charity. It was a compensation fund, a quiet, public admission of their part in the injustice. It was used to repair the Whitcomb wagon, to restock their larder, and to provide for the other homesteaders who had been pushed to the edge by Crow's manufactured drought. Jonah met Eliza on the porch of their cabin the day she returned. He had grown in her absence, the boyish softness in his face replaced by a new, sober maturity. He did not speak at first, simply wrapped her in a fierce hug. Then he stepped back, his eyes full of a shame that was painful to see. "I am sorry, Eliza. I was wrong. I was scared, and I believed the lies. About you, and about them." He looked toward the mountains. "That man, Nantan, he saved me in the pass. You knew he was not what they said. You tried to tell me." Eliza put a hand on his shoulder. "We were all scared. Jonah, fear makes people blind. The important thing is to open your eyes when the light comes." The Apache community remained distant. They did not come into the town. They watched from the high ground as the fence posts were pulled from the earth. The wounds were too deep for a quick healing. Trust, once so thoroughly broken, would have to be rebuilt one stone at a time, over years, not days. But they saw the water running free again. They saw that the soldiers no longer rode with suspicion in their eyes. One evening, as Eliza was tending the small garden her mother had planted, a figure appeared at the edge of her property. It was the elder, Two Rivers. He did not approach the house, but waited for her to come to him. He carried no weapons. He looked at her, his ancient eyes holding a deep, solemn respect. "You spoke the truth in a house of lies," he said, his English slow and careful. "You stood for the water. You stood for the land." He held out a small, soft leather pouch, intricately beaded and tied with a leather thong. It was filled with a mixture of dried herbs, their scent clean and sharp on the evening air. "A gift," he said, "for the life of the soldier boy. Nantan saved his body from the rock. You saved his mind from the poison. You are a healer, Eliza Jane Whitcomb, in your own way." He placed the pouch in her hand, his fingers dry and warm, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the twilight from which he had come. Eliza stood for a long time, the pouch in her hand, the scent of the healing herbs a fragile, hopeful promise. The season of fire and dust was over. The long, slow rains had begun. The season of rain that followed the trial was a long, slow exhalation of breath the valley had been holding for a year. The water, now free and clean, ran in the creek bed where before there had been only dust and cracked earth. New green shoots, impossibly vibrant, pushed their way through the thirsty soil. The air smelled of wet sage and damp soil, the scent of healing. Life was returning. Tentative at first, then with a quiet, stubborn persistence. The Whitcomb homestead began to feel like a home again. Jonah, with the help of a few neighbors, repaired the wagon properly and reinforced the leaky roof of the cabin. He moved with a new confidence. The uncertainty of youth burned away by the hard lessons of the past months. He spoke of building a larger corral, of buying a few more head of cattle with the money from the town's compensation fund. He was no longer a boy leaning on his sister. He was a young man laying the foundation of his own future. Eliza found a different kind of peace, a quiet rhythm in the daily work of survival. She tended her garden, her hands in the cool, damp earth, and felt the slow, steady pulse of the land returning to health. She had her name back. She had her home. But a question lingered in the quiet moments, a gentle but persistent current beneath the surface of her new life. What now? The answer, or at least a possible answer, arrived with the mail rider. It was a letter from her mother's sister in Philadelphia, a woman she had not seen since she was a small girl. Her aunt had read of the trial in the Eastern newspapers, where the story of Silas Crow's downfall had become a sensational tale of frontier justice. The letter was filled with a mixture of horror for what Eliza had endured and a stern, practical love. It ended with an offer. "Come home, Eliza," her aunt had written. "There is no life for a decent young woman in such a savage place. You have been through enough. Come back east. There is a fine new hospital here, and I have spoken to the head doctor. They have a program for training nurses. You have a good mind and a strong heart. There is a place for you here, a respectable, useful life, away from all that dust and violence." Eliza read the letter 3 times, standing on the porch as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. The words were a siren song of safety and certainty. Philadelphia, a world of brick sidewalks, gas lights, and orderly hospitals. A world where the law was not a thing to be fought for with rifles and desperation, but a solid, dependable fact. A world where she could learn a proper skill, could become a nurse, could spend her life healing people in clean, white rooms. It was everything her parents had wanted for her, a life of security and progress, the very dream that had led them west in the first place. She looked out at the valley, at the immense, soul-achingly beautiful and empty landscape. Here, there were no hospitals, no doctors, only the quiet wisdom of women like Ishani and the hard-earned knowledge of settlers who learned to stitch their own wounds and set their own bones. 2 Rivers had called her a healer, but what did she know? Really, she knew how to cool a fever, how to make a poultice for a sprain. It was a flimsy shield against the brutal realities of this land. For days, she was torn. The valley was in her blood now, the red dust a part of her soul. She had fought for this place, had bled for it. To leave it felt like a betrayal. But the promise of the East was the promise of a different kind of strength, the power of knowledge, of training, of a world where a woman's worth was not measured by her ability to endure hardship, but by her skill and intellect. She walked the land, her father's journal in her hands, her limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. She found herself at the creek, now running full and clear, and saw a family of Apache women filling their water jugs, their children laughing as they splashed in the shallows. They saw her and did not run. They gave her a cautious, respectful nod, a small but profound acknowledgement of the new peace. She was a part of this landscape now, a landmark in their new map of the world. That evening, she found Jonah by the corral, checking the latch on the new gate. She told him about their aunt's letter, about the offer. He listened, his face serious in the fading light. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, You should go." His words were a surprise, a small, sharp pain. "You want me to leave?" He shook his head. "No, I do not want you to leave. But you have been taking care of other people your whole life. First Ma and Pa, then me, then the whole valley. I suppose you have never had a chance to do something just for you. If you want to be a nurse, you should go be the best nurse they have ever seen. I can manage here. I am not a boy anymore." In his quiet, selfless words, she found her answer. He was right. She had never made a choice that was entirely her own, and now, given that freedom, she knew what she had to do. She was not the same girl who had come to this valley. The East, with its order and its rules, felt like a cage. Her healing was needed here, in this place of broken bones and broken trust. She would not be one nurse among many in a great hospital. She would be the only one for 100 miles. It was a harder path, a lonelier one, but it was hers. She spent the next morning writing a letter to her aunt. She thanked her for her kindness, but she respectfully declined the offer. She wrote, "My work is here. There is much to be healed, and I have found that my hands, however untrained, are needed." That evening, she rode out to the creek, to a place where the cottonwoods grew thick and the water ran deep and slow. Nantan was there, as if he had known she would come. He was not waiting for her, but simply existing in the space, a part of the evening's quiet grace. She dismounted and walked to the water's edge. She told him, "I am staying." He did not seem surprised. He looked at her, his gaze taking in the new certainty in her eyes. "This is your home," he said. "It is good when a person knows their home." She said, "I thought about going east, to learn medicine, to become a nurse." "You are a nurse," he said simply. "You have the hands for it. The rest is just learning new words for things you already know." He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew something out. He held it out to her on his open palm. It was a knife. The handle was carved from a piece of juniper wood, worn smooth and dark with age. The blade was steel, sharp and practical. Intricate patterns were carved into the wooden handle, lines and symbols that spoke of the wind, the water, and the mountains. He said, "This was my grandfather's, the one who walked home. It is a tool for cutting rope, for carving wood, for making a home. It is a thing of responsibility." He placed it in her hand. The wood was warm, and it seemed to fit her grip perfectly. It was not a jewel, not a flower. It was something real, something useful, something strong. It was not a promise of ownership, not a symbol of possession. It was an acknowledgement of a shared path, a shared duty. They stood in silence as the last light faded and the first stars appeared. Their future was a road with no map, a vast, unknown territory. There were no grand promises of forever, no vows of a life without hardship. Their love was like the valley itself, a thing born of a hard and beautiful reality. It was a quiet, unadorned commitment to stand together, to do what was right, to be healers in a land that was just beginning to remember how. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. They turned and walked to their horses, side by side. They rode along the bank of the creek, the sound of the flowing water a soft, constant murmur in the twilight. The first drops of a gentle night rain began to fall, landing on the thirsty, healing earth, a quiet blessing on the path that lay before them. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.